Vayadaber YHWH El Moshe Lemor. Shalom and welcome to another edition of our Daily Bread. This week's Parashat is called Parashat Pinchas. It's the 8th Parashat of the book of Bamidbar, also called Numbers. It's called Pinchas, which means mouth of copper. And that was the opening verse that I was reading of the Parashat, which said, YHWH spoke unto Moshe, saying. Now, in this week's Parashat, we see a couple of things. We're going to get into the bulk of the story of Pinchas, which started at the end of last week's Parashat, where he killed Zimri and Cosby, the Israeli and the Midianite woman, who came and ultimately, as it goes into this week's Parashat, it talks about how they got the children of Israel to worship their gods, and that was the sin that they brought in. It also is going to go into the numbering of the children of Israel for war, to go to war with Midian. They number the children of Israel plus the priests, which aren't numbered to go to war, but they did number them as a separate note. And then we get into the concept of the daughters of Zelophehad, who had no sons, and Zelophehad had no sons, and he just had daughters, and so they asked for some of their inheritance, basically, that the sons would have gotten. They asked for, and then we see the ruling on that, and then you end up the end of the Parashat with the concept of the children of Israel, and we get actually goes into the daily offerings. We see that Moshe is replaced by Yahushua, and also sees the promised land, but isn't allowed to go into it. And then we get the laws of the offerings for the holy days in Numbers 28. And we end with the half Torah in Aleph Melachim, which is 1 Kings, where we discuss Eliyahu and Isabel, who's trying to kill him, and then he comes back. He goes and hides in the cave, and then he comes back. So this week's Parashat, always a good Parashat. My message for 2011-12 is called Appointed, and the concept that I'm going to talk about in this week's Parashat is just how this concept of being appointed ties into all of these different things. We start with the story of Zimri and Cosby, who are killed by Pinchas, which is Eleazar's son, which is Aharon's son. So we have it down the priestly line there. And, when you read it on the surface, you think, on the surface you go, he killed these people who were kind of blatantly sinning before everybody, but and even stopped the plague, which was going on. And then he gets this covenant of peace made with him, which is a pretty big deal. And it's made with him and his seed after him forever. So that's very interesting. But this concept of being appointed there's really two sides of it. The first point that I'll make is this concept of being appointed by choice. And what I mean with that is that there's some people who, when we think of appointed, we think of someone else appointing you for something. But what we see in the Torah is that it really comes back to us. There's certainly some things that are appointed to people, but there's other things that we kind of appoint to ourselves. In other words, we bring ourselves to them based on our choices. The people who are wicked appoint themselves for destruction. They appoint themselves to death, ultimately. Now, many people might get, as it says, many come to me in that day saying, Lord, Lord, and he says, get away from me, I never knew you. Mashiach is talking there. And we see this concept where there's going to be a little bit of a disconnect between what people thought, right, as they reply, oh, haven't we cast out demons in your name and done all this stuff? There's some people who have self-appointed themselves, and they're going to be shocked when they don't get what they think they should get. And they even pretend or are self-delusional about being appointed for different positions, thinking it's from God, even, when really they self-appointed themselves. Now, there's times when that's actually even okay, or it appears to be okay. We see a situation even in this week's Parashat with Caleb and Yahushua, where, in a sense, by obeying, they appointed themselves in a way to a position of being there to go into the promised land, whereas the other 10 spies who went and looked at the promised land, they appointed themselves to death. You see, we make a choice, and the appointment is really, we think of it as something that's been put upon us. But a lot of times there's things that God puts upon us, and there's things that we put upon ourselves, good and bad. Now, in the case of Zimri and Cosby, Zimri, the Israeli, was having relations with this Midianite woman. And so by that choice, he ultimately, if he could look forward and read this portion of the Parashat, would know that at that point that he made that choice to do that sin before Eleazar and before the children of Israel, that he was appointing to himself death. He was appointing to himself a position in the Torah to be an example of what not to do. He was also, in part of a situation where then Pinchas, who does have a position in Israel, came out and brought judgment upon Zimri and Cosby, and it stopped the plague. And it said that he was jealous or zealous. Both words are used in this sentence when we get into it, and it talks in verse 25:11 about him being zealous, and that also that YHWH didn't consume the children of Israel in his jealousy. It's actually a similar word. The first word for zealous, it can be used for jealousy, and it's just a variation that is used later for jealousy in there of the same root word. Now this concept of being jealous and zealous for YHWH is a very interesting and important concept, because it shows this concept where you think about the emotions of both zealousness and jealousy. Jealousy is like this tidal wave of emotion and this feeling that you've been wronged, right? And you can't shake it. And when you think about this concept of Pinchas looking out and seeing this sin that was going on and feeling jealous for YHWH, feeling that feeling of overwhelming emotion that this is not right, this is a betrayal, this is not okay, this is something that's being done, that isn't acceptable, and that stirred up emotion, and he ultimately killed them, which normally I would say is an interesting point, because normally, right, someone worthy of death, you're supposed to bring him before the judges, and it's very possible that Pinchas could have been a judge. He's certainly of high position, being of Aharon's line. But one thing that I see is that he took action, and he wasn't criticized for this in this particular case, and he was actually given a covenant of peace. And we think, wait a minute, it's almost like vigilante justice. How could he going and doing this bring about a covenant of peace? It didn't seem very peaceful for him to see this person go out and grab a javelin and kill them. But the fact is that, I think, points to the spirit that is within, that concept of jealousy. It's really a feeling inside, and it's something that can be very strong, and just see the wrongness and the wickedness being done before God and before the other children of Israel, and just saying stop, basically. It's interesting that the Cosby, a Midianite woman. If you look at this in the model, what you see is you see that the children of Israel, a child of Israel, right, is joining himself to a woman from another nation. Not only that, a woman who worships another god. And we see that women can sometimes be a model of the heart. And even beyond that, it can be a model of emotion or lust. And so, if you look at this concept, you can see that he was joined to a strange heart or strange lust, one that wasn't right. So there's really a double entendre here, because it's not only was it the strange woman, but it was also a strange god that these Midianite women were causing the children of Israel to lust after this and do worship of this other god. And we see this concept that the children of Israel should have righteous desires, not desires that are foreign, not desires, and the desires that are foreign to Israel would be to worship other gods, would be to take these women from other nations, nations that many times they either wiped out or were wicked, and actually desire them. When we think about a man and a woman, man desiring a woman, and you see that this is not a good desire for a child of Israel. And so part of that mixing the desires of the world with the desires of God and the desires of the children of God, you can see that it didn't belong. And it was Pinchas who came out and stopped it and said, basically, it's enough. It needs to stop. He didn't say that, but I mean, that's through the actions. It was to see this sin and cease that sin. And when he did that, the plague ceased as well. So it's a very interesting thing. We can, in a way, it's like you say, well, who appointed you? But see, when you do what's right, just making that choice, it's okay to appoint yourself to doing right. It doesn't matter if you're part of Israel or you're not, or if that was your position or not. You see, what people fail to do a lot of times is appoint themselves to take a stand and do what's right for themselves, for what's right. They don't know the Word of God, and so how can they make a stand for the Word of God? While, on the other hand, there's many people who make a stand supposedly for the Word of God, but it's not just. It's not in alignment with the Torah. So there's a lot of self-appointed people who are self-righteous, and they think that this story of Pinchas could have gone another way. He could have been punished if his deed was wrong. At the end of the day, God knows, and God decided that this was actually a very good thing. And God can weigh life and death. God can judge life and death. Now, for most of us, we can't, or we shouldn't, for the most part, certainly not for other people, because we don't even judge life and death correctly for ourselves. If we were a just judge, we wouldn't choose sin which would bring death to us. That's not good judgment. That's crazy judgment. And so, if I'll kill myself with my own sin by making choices, if I'll decide that my judgment will bring forth a choice that brings death even to myself, a person who will kill themselves with bad judgment, in what place should they be looking at someone else's life and determining, judgment on them? Doesn't really, shouldn't happen. And see, that's what I see with a lot of religious people. They're very zealous about other people and passing judgment on other people. But you can look at the choices that they've made for themselves and say, wow, your judgment is not good, even when it comes to yourself. How much worse when it comes to other people? And this is what I think Mashiach meant when he says, take the beam out of your own eye before you worry about the speck, so you could see good enough to get the speck out of your brother's eye. So we're talking about this concept of being appointed. The next thing in this parasha is the children of Israel numbered over 20. Now this is an appointment to war. Now they're being counted. And all those people, one interesting point, is that all the people that fell in that range of 20 years and older, that were fit to go to war, they were all responsible. See, a lot of times what we see now is we see in modern religion Somebody say, oh, well, that's so-and-so's, there's a teacher. And see, they want to say, that person can go study the Torah who's in front of their room. They're in charge of, they're the warrior and they're the representative for God, and they're going to do all that so that I don't have to. But see, I look at that and I say, no, there is no pastor, people in the pew setup. When it comes to studying Torah, everybody's responsible, just like they were to going to war, right? In our country, people volunteer to go into the military, okay? And what happens is, there's a lot of people who take the benefits from it, but most of them don't ever go and defend the country. Whereas with Israel, it was a little different story. If you were of the right age, everybody was numbered, and with the few exceptions that the Torah makes, everybody was responsible for their part of going to war and defending the country and doing all of that and fighting. And it's just really too bad that people don't apply this to Torah study, because I see it all the time, that there could be 1,000 Messianics out there, and they want to listen to 5 Torah teachers, Messianic Torah teachers. They'll tune in, they'll buy the DVDs, they'll do all this and that. And the fact is, they're not acting like a true Israeli, because they're not stepping up and saying, wait a minute, we're the children of God, so it's my responsibility, it's your responsibility, it's everybody's responsibility to study and learn and know the Torah. Not just this, I'll be lazy and I'll let somebody else study, and then I'll kind of glean from what they study. That's not how it's supposed to be, and I think that's an important part of this week's Parashat, that we can see in the numbering of the children of Israel to war, that in this case, people there were appointed to war. And there was a massive number, 600,000, let's see, I think it was 600 and, I want to say it was 601,730, if I remember right. And then there's 23,000 priests that were numbered. See, they weren't numbered to go to war, but they were numbered for other duties, and they were appointed for other duties. And they're counted. And it's a lot of people count themselves as part of Israel. A lot of people count themselves as a child of Elohim, a child of God. And yet they don't do their duty and their requirement. They get fuzzy when it comes to that, when it comes to, well, okay, these people who are over 20 years old and fit to go to war, they went to war and fought. It didn't matter if, one was a carpenter and another was a scribe or whatever it was. You went in and you did your part. And there was that responsibility. Well, now, there's a lot of people who claim to follow God and be religious. They've never even read the book, okay? If you haven't read the Bible from cover to cover, then I suggest you do so. That's part of your duty. It's just like the duty of a king, right? The king in Israel had to write out his own copy of the Torah. Okay? It'd probably be better if everybody did that. If everybody looked at every single word of the Word of God. But see, as a citizen of the kingdom of Elohim, it requires some action. Look, in this week's Parashat, we saw Caleb and Yahushua, right? They stood up. They were willing to go in and fight the giants. And that's why they got to go in. The people who weren't willing to do what it took, who wanted to just sit back and not do anything, the spies who said, hey, we can't do it, they all died in the wilderness. They weren't worthy of going into the kingdom, because worthiness didn't come by just God appointing somebody as worthy. They were all the children of Israel. They were even princes of the tribes. They'd already been appointed to a high position, just like Korach was appointed to a high position as a priest. But he blew it, and so did they, because they wouldn't do what was required. They wanted to do something else or nothing. And see, that's an important message to understand, is that if you're appointed, especially if you're self-appointing yourself as a child of God, then you better make sure that you're willing to take part and do your part. It is a war. It is a war of principalities. It is a war of good and evil, and most importantly, that war is raging inside your heart and inside your mind every day as you make choices between good and evil. And the Word of God really is the armor. And the Word of God does strengthen and protect you. And if you don't study it, You're going to war without armor. You're going to be easily slain by your own sin, by your own choices, if you refuse to put on any armor going into war. So we see also this concept of being appointed to life or death. You know, it's interesting that when you look at all the things with Kalev and Yahushua, you see that some people simply made the choice, right? Their end was going to be death because of the choices they made. Other people made good choices and obeyed God. They're appointing for themselves a future of life. So we can create that own appointment by our choices that we do. There's things that God appoints to people. And just like the stranger of Isaiah 56, where it says, even if the person's not part of the children of Israel, say they keep the Sabbath from polluting it, they do things that please me and take hold of my covenant, they'll get a name better than sons and daughters. So now they're going to be appointed a greater name than sons and daughters based on their choices. Now, if they don't choose that, then they're not appointed to that position. But the fact is there's some people who think God does all the work, right? And there's other people who think that they can self-appoint themselves to things that they can, that are only God-given things. But there's also things that we choose, good and evil. We can appoint ourselves to life or death, as it says, choose life or death, I set them before you. So those are the four quadrants, so to speak, of appointment. There's God's appointment, which is what He appoints for you, where you have no choice. There's things that He didn't appoint you for, that some people try and make by their own appointment. And you have to know the difference between those things, and you have to know when it's okay to do right, even if it's not your place, even if there's no reward, even if you don't belong to the children of Israel. Doing right is doing right. And in the case of Pinchas, he did what was right in that situation, and God rewarded him for it. Even though it may not have been his position, it may not have been the protocol. The fact was, the end answer was correct. And I think a lot of people, they do the opposite with that in religion. They say, well, I'm saved, or, I'm Jewish, or I'm this, or I'm that, I'm a child of Abraham. Whatever it is, they try and point to the things that they don't have control over and try and boast in that, instead of boasting in the things that you do have control over, such as your choices and the things that you can impact. So when we see this, we see the next thing, which is the story of the daughters of Zelohad. And we see this is what I call inheritance with strings. In other words, we think of inheritance as the same way, right? It goes into appointment. Like, well, you can't change your inheritance. I mean, that's just given to you. It wasn't because of anything you did, good or bad, right? It's just given to you. It's been prepared before you were there, and you're going to just receive it no matter what. Not exactly totally true. The deal with the daughters of Zelohad is, here the daughters didn't have the inheritance. It was going to go to the sons, which, as a side note, is a whole separate little funny situation where a gal the other Shabbat ago was trying to sell me on the concept of the Jewish idea that Jewishness goes through the mother. And that's a fun concept. It's great if you have a vested interest in trying to prove that it's angled from saying that Yitzhak is the promised seed and not Yishmael. But the fact is that both of them are the seed of Abraham, and there's blessings for the seed of Abraham. The only difference is that the promised seed, there's other promises and things like that. The promised child that God promised to Sarah wasn't Yishmael. It was Yitzhak. That was the miracle, the miraculous birth. Okay? But that doesn't annul the fact that Yishmael is still a child of Abraham, depending, of course, also on how he acts. Because Mashiach said, if you were Abraham's seed, you would have Abraham's works. So the point is, though, is that we get into this daughters of Zelohad, and it's the same thing that's proven here, which is the inheritance goes to the sons, and the daughters, they go to another man, right? And that man has his inheritance from his father. And that she becomes one with him, and she gets to enjoy his inheritance. But normally she wouldn't get the inheritance from her father. It goes to his sons. But now in this case, her father, their father, didn't have any sons. And so there's a ruling that has to be made. Now, the inheritance ends up going to the daughters of Zelohad, but it also comes with strings attached, because as you read about the daughters of Zelohad, you see that they're also required to basically marry within their own tribe. And what that means is that even if it didn't go to the daughters, say they didn't have any daughters and the sons died, if you follow the rules of the Torah, then it talks about, okay, then it's going to go to the brother, and then it's going to go to the next of kin, and it stays anyway in the tribe, even if there's no daughters. So even though it's given to the daughters, then they have to marry the someone in their tribe, so that the inheritance doesn't leave the tribe. And the other man, which would also be part of that tribe, is some type of kin to that person who is part of that tribe one way or another. They're connected. And so in that case, it's just interesting, because the inheritance ultimately kind of ends up where it needed to end up along the normal lines anyway. And at least that's my understanding of the daughters of Zelohad. This goes into this concept that there's something required of us in our appointment. So even the daughters of Zelohad were given their inheritance. The person could say, well, that's their inheritance. That was their father's. First of all, not initially it wasn't, until God ruled that it was. It wasn't just automatically that way. But more importantly, is they had requirements to meet, even though they're part of the inheritance. See, let me say that again. There's requirements, even though you're part of the inheritance. So it goes back to this same thing, that there's a lot of people who feel like God is their inheritance, and they don't have any requirements. Once they just say they believe, or they just figure, whatever I'm doing right now, that's good enough. And I have to disagree with that. There is requirements upon us, and those things aren't just given to us freely. So next we get into this week's Parashat, and we see this concept of Yahushua being over Israel. And this paints a super obvious and very beautiful picture, which is he tells Moshe asked for him to set a man. That's the word pakad. It's also translated as a point. He's asking him to appoint a man, and he says, you don't want Israel to run around like sheep without a shepherd, which is a great reminder for us of this concept that Moshe wants them to have a shepherd when he's gone. And if you take away the law of Moshe, right? Because Moshe in this parashat, he's going to die. In type and model, that would be like people doing away with the law. You know what happens if the law is done away with? Moshe's gone. That's likened unto what he says, that it's like the people being sheep without a shepherd. So Moshe was the first shepherd. Now, if people say that Moshe's done away with, the law's done away with, and that Mashiach isn't going to uphold that same law, right? Then they're saying they're going to get rid of the shepherd, and someone else who isn't even a shepherd is going to take the flock, right? And that's kind of where Christianity, if you look at it, paints that. They paint that Moshe's gone, and the interesting thing, the way they paint it, is that Yahushua, right, that Jesus showed up and therefore got rid of Moshe. Is that the pattern that we have? Or is the pattern here that Yahushua was around long here before the son of Nun, Yahushua the son of Nun, was around long before Moshe passed over rulership to him? So, as a matter of fact, you see Caleb and Yahushua, way back with the spies, were some of the princes that went into the land. Now, according to the Christian model, if Yahushua, right, which models the replacement of Moshe, if him just showing up on the scene pretty much annulled and did away with it, that's not what happened. Yahushua was there along with Moshe, abiding by the rule of Moshe, being commanded by Moshe, and then Moshe is the one who passes on the mantle, so to speak, to Yahushua by the will of YHWH. But Moshe asked for that to happen. Now, this takes us to the words of the Master where he says, if you would believe Moshe, you would believe me because he wrote of me. Do you see that? So Mashiach in the New Testament was saying that this Moshe, he's the one ushering me in, just like it is right here. He's not a replacement. He didn't come and strike Moshe down and strike him dead and say, oh, you worthless person. He didn't come and say, oh, like some people say, the law wasn't good enough, that's why it never was going to work, and it passed away, right? Yahushua didn't come in and say that to Moshe. He didn't go, oh, you were never meant to be the leader of Israel. God knew you weren't going to be successful. That's why he brought me in. Be gone. It didn't work that way. It was Moshe who spoke to YHWH and asked him for a shepherd. And that shepherd, who'd already been with Moshe and under his command, just like Mashiach, was a keeper of the law, right? He was obeying that authority that Moshe had, but he would ultimately take over as the job of the shepherd. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Yahushua, the son of Nun, has the same name as the Mashiach, and the transition goes from Moshe to Yahushua to take him into the promised land. So what happened? It was Moshe that brought him out of Mitzrayim, right? But guess who was there? The blood of the Lamb. The Lamb had a part, right? In the Ramez, that's symbolic of the teachings of the Lamb, or the teachings of Mashiach on the doorpost, right? Which is also known as the Ten Commandments. We put those on the doorpost. So it's those teachings, and more importantly, the Spirit, right? That's what the blood represents, the Spirit, the inside. This is what Mashiach came teaching. He came teaching the Spirit. He says, it says don't murder, but I say, if you look on a woman with lust, you're guilty of the sin. See, he's talking about the Spirit. If you've already spiritually sinned before you've ever got to the action. So if you follow his teachings, you'll see that he taught about the spiritual laws of Torah. So that's that blood on the doorpost back from way beginning. And then when we see it over here, it's a natural progression from physical, letter of the law, Moshe, who taught them the law, but Moshe wasn't going to take them into the promised land, just like the letter of the law isn't enough by itself to take us into the promised land, because the promised land is a spiritual land, a spiritual kingdom, right? It says God is spiritual, we must worship him spiritually. So when we look at that, Mashiach takes us to that next level. The Spirit of the Torah doesn't do away with the Torah, reveals the Spirit of the Torah, which is much greater than just the letter of the Torah. And he's going to be the one, right, who takes us in. Now with Moshe going away, and Moshe representing the letter, the physical, and he represents the Spirit, right? What happens when you remove the outward, the earthly, and reveal the inward? That's the model of circumcision. The outward covering, the man, the flesh, is cut away to reveal the inward man. And it's from the inward man that life comes. So we see this pattern as a pattern. There's many patterns and layers and levels that we can understand from this. But I love this part when we get to this part, and Moshe is making reference to the shepherd, right? And it's also interesting, notice what Mashiach says, when the shepherd, right? When you smite the shepherd, and then the flock is scattered. And we always think, oh, he's talking about himself. But it's actually, there's more than one teaching there. Smiting the shepherd is just like what Christianity does when they're trying to do away with the law. Because the first shepherd was Moshe. and they want to smite the shepherd, right? And what will happen to Israel if you take away the law and the Torah? They're scattered, right? Now, you said it, if you take away the law, right, they're scattered. Now, why was Israel scattered? When you look at Lo Ami, Lo Ruhama, and you look at the book of Hosea, and you talk about the 12 tribes. Israel was scattered among the nations for what? For their sin. Do you see the connection there? When they smite the shepherd, right? That's the same as when they smite the Torah. When they get rid of the Torah, what happens to Israel? They sin. What happens when they sin? They're scattered. You see? Now, what's Mashiach's job as the second shepherd, right? Is to bring them back. So if they were scattered when you smote Moshe, the Torah, you took the Torah away, and people went into wickedness, then what do you think the next shepherd, the greater shepherd, will do? He will return them. Now, if they're returned, guess what they're returned to? The Torah. Only this time, the spirit of the Torah, which is actually even greater than the letter. Now, it's not just if you have relations with another man's wife, it's if you even look on a woman with lust. We've taken it to a spiritual level. That includes sending the love letter. That includes holding hands. That includes all lusts. Right? So how big was the letter of the law compared to the spirit of the law? Spirit of the law includes all expressions. Letter of the law, one expression. It's a training wheels. Moshe is the training wheels for us. He comes first because, right, just like foreskin, it's on there only for the first 8 days. Right? And then it comes off. Right? That's the model that we see here, that the letter of the law is important. It's a great starting place. People think it's too hard. I don't know what you're expecting. It doesn't get easier. It's going to get immensely more broad when you go to the spirit of the law, which includes not just the act of murder, but not even being angry with your brother without cause. That includes everything from hitting him over the head with a baseball bat, stabbing him with a knife, smashing his finger in the door. I mean, all those things that you do out of anger that is unjust, that is without cause, that's equal to that same sin of murder. That's the spirit of it. The simple expression that we start with, like training wheels, is let's stop from going out and actually murdering somebody. That's the big one. We'll start with something like play school that's so big and obvious that you shouldn't do. And yet people feel it's such a burden and it's such a big thing. The fact is those are the easiest things. 10 Commandments, 613 commandments in the Torah, that's the easy stuff. That's for babies. Okay? Then when you start to graduate a little bit and you're ready to go to more, you can start getting in the New Testament where Mashiach starts expanding, like it says in Isaiah that the Mashiach would do. He magnifies the law and makes it honorable. Well, it's more honorable to not be angry with your brother without cause than it is to just not murder him, because there's lots of things you can do along the way that are not good. It's more honorable to not look on a woman with lust than it is to just not sleep with another man's wife, due to the fact that there's a lot of place in between where you can be doing things that aren't technically sleeping with his wife, but are not okay. So there's more honor in the spirit of Torah because it's greater and it's larger. So these are all important things. So when we see Yahushua being over Israel, and we see this concept where he says, the sheep with no shepherd, and then you got to tie that into the New Testament where it talks about smiting the shepherd and the flock will be scattered. And I love, again, how a lot of people only see that as, oh, well, if Mashiach was smitten, then the flock was scattered. But the same pattern holds true to the Torah. If the Christians smite the Torah, they smite Moshe, the original shepherd, Israel will be scattered. And they've always been scattered for one reason in the Bible, and that's for disobedience. So it all shows the same thing. Disobedience scatters Israel. That's equal to smiting Moshe, or getting rid of the law, or diminishing the law. It causes the scattering. And what is Mashiach's job? One of them is prophesied to do is to regather Israel. So what does that do? What's that mean? It means returning them to the law. Smiting, when they stop obeying the law, they are scattered. When they obey the law, then the law is their shepherd and gathers them. I mean, that's simple. It doesn't matter if it's Moshe or Yahushua. So we get into this concept where they pass over this this job of the shepherd onto Yahushua. And that one to me was such a play school one. Like, look, Moshe is passing it on to Yahushua, who's the new shepherd. You don't have to be really deep to be able to see the connection between Moshe and Yahushua, or Yeshua, as some people call him, and how that same pattern happened already once, and it happened again. So we get into the next section, which is the offering and the days. And this takes us to another example where it's just people don't get the whole thing. They get only part of it. See, they think they get Yahushua. They think they get the new shepherd, but they don't want to be connected to the old shepherd. They want to actually smite the old shepherd. You know, why did Moshe have to go up and die and not get to go in? Because he was supposed to talk, right, to the rock. Instead, he smote the rock. You know, and that's a great analogy where you can see, Christians should be talking to Moshe, right? If they're Mashiach's followers, right? Should his disciples smite Moshe, who he obeyed, right? Jesus obeyed the law. That's what makes him perfect. So should they come then and smite the law down as his disciples? No. Because Jesus didn't smite the law down. Okay? He didn't come and strike down Moshe. And Moshe didn't strike him down either. As a matter of fact, if you follow the original narrative, there's just repeating patterns. He did what was right. He obeyed. Just like Yahushua, the son of Nun, when he was told to go into the promised land, he was one of the few people who obeyed. Now we got Jesus over here, who's, guess what? One of the few people who ever obeyed all of the Torah. He didn't smite it down. He obeyed it when everyone else wasn't. And if we look back to this story, we see that God's patterns don't change, and he, for that reason, is allowed into the promised land. And you notice, remember what it says when it was talking about Caliph and Yahushua? It says they had a different spirit. You see? Another indicator there talking about the spirit that they had, which is what Mashiach teaches, about the spirit of Torah. So, you see that they're going to come in, and now we have the offering of days. So many people think about the holy days, and they don't. If I went and asked the average person, well, what's the offering for Yom Teruah? They don't know. They don't know it's a young bullock, a ram, 7 lambs of the first year, and a kid of the goats for a sin offering. Well, how much? What else goes with it? Well, you get with that, you're going to get a minka, a grain offering, and for the bowl, right? You know, you're gonna. It's a third, right? I'm trying to remember now. It's a third, and you get a third of a hin. I'm sorry, a third of a hin of wine. It gets the minka, which is 3/10 deals of fine flour mingled with oil. Then you get to the ram. The ram is 2/10 deals. So each offering gets a different grain offering amount, and that one doesn't get it gets half a hin of wine. And then you get to, well, what do we give for the lambs of the first year? Well, they get a separate tenth, single tenth of fine flour mingled with oil, and they get a third of a hin. I'm sorry, they get a quarter of a hin. So of wine. So each one of those, it's important to be thinking about these things. You know, what's the offering, for Shavuot? What about Pesach? What about a new moon? How about your Sabbath offering? Well, you have your daily offering, lamb of the first year, minka and a drink offering. Again, it's a separate, it's 1/10 of fine flour mingled with oil, and then you get, it's a wine offering also. And when you look at each of these things, you think, why do I need to know that? People skip over this stuff. Well, that's the problem. I'm working on learning these things. Why? It may not seem important to you, but it's in the Word of God. It's important. Trust me. Everything in that Word of God is important, and understanding The difference that the first holy days, they got one, or they got 2 young bullocks, and then when you get to the second set of the harvest, the second harvest, they're very similar, but they go to 1 young bullock for the offerings until you get to Sukkot. This stuff all matters, and if you don't know it, it's kind of like people will take the holy days and say, "Oh, I'm celebrating Pesach," or "Oh, I'm celebrating the Sabbath," but they have no idea what offerings. I love this Parashat in Numbers 28. It teaches us the offerings for each of these days. And why doesn't anyone care? Why doesn't anybody want to know what these things are? Because they want just the surface level stuff, right? They want the inheritance without the requirements. They want Yahushua without Moshe. They want, they want to be appointed or counted as Israel, but we don't want to have to go to war. Which was part of the problem going back with the princes and the spies who were sent along with Caleb and Yahushua. See, everybody wants parts to yank parts out of it and get the blessings. They don't want to do their part. And we see even in the scenario with the holy days, and we see this with this concept in the half-Torah, which was Eliyahu fleeing from Isabel because she was going to kill him. And there's a time when you just got to try and stay alive. And he went away and probably would have died. And he was, YHWH fed him and preserved him, but not for nothing, because his job was to come back, right? And to say, hey, great, you kept me alive. Good, I'm going to go start a new village over here. It doesn't work that way. He was preserved with a purpose, which is he was going to go back and anoint the kings, 2 kings and the prophet. So he didn't just get to take what was good for him, which was to survive, and the food and the water, and do whatever he wanted. And so that's the message of this week's Parashat, is that for every part that you find interesting, you're ignoring another part. For each thing that you'd love to appoint yourself to, there's a requirement that you've been appointed to do as well. And we need to accept the whole package. And that's really what I get from this week's Parashat, is that, this covenant of peace made with Pinchas, it wasn't without cost. He put his life on the line, in my opinion, when he killed Zimri and Cosby, because he didn't deliver him to the judges. And yet, it was the right choice. And that it was probably a difficult thing. I mean, people might just think, oh yeah, everybody I bet, he saw someone wickedness, I would have stabbed him too. And it's like, no. When you're in the real situation, I don't think so. It's a difficult thing. And the fact is just like Yahushua and Caleb, when everyone else was doing the wrong thing, Pinchas stood up and did what was right. He took the difficult side, and then he got the blessing. And that's what we need to do. So until next time, I'm going to say, keep your eyes all the way open. Look for both the offerings and the holy days. Look for all the parts that come along with the part that you're paying attention to, because there's almost always additional parts and requirements for us. So until next time, I'm going to say, Shalom.